Hey church, back to you with another midweek video. Again, the purpose of these videos is that we would not just be hearers of the word, but be doers. It's my desire that taking this little time in the middle of the week will help us think on the sermon that we just heard, apply it to our lives, and prepare ourselves for the teaching to come. So having said that, let's hop right into it. Last week we went through Revelation 14, and we see Revelation 14 is the great harvest of the earth. We see that Jesus orders his angels to come and reap the earth, and he's reaping between wheat and weeds, or what we would call believers and unbelievers. In the parable that he gives in Matthew 13, the sons of the kingdom and the sons of the devil. We talked a lot about the difference between the two sons, but most of what we talked about was the end of Revelation 14, where God gives a symbol of what he does with the sons of the evil one, what he does with those who do not follow him. And he gives this imagery of a great wine press. It's called the great wine press of God's wrath. And what it's alluding to is those who don't follow Jesus, who are not walking with him, who do not place their trust and their faith in him. Those people will not go into the kingdom. They will meet the wrath of God. And it was a very awkward time, because I think one of the reasons that we don't hear a lot of Revelation talk in the church today, one, the book can be a little confusing, but also here we are in chapter 14, and we are still talking about wrath. It can be exhausting to people. And my encouragement to us is to not shy away from that. I mean, this is Jesus. Revelation is a revelation of Jesus. This is what he wants us to know. And he starts the first few chapters off telling the church to repent, 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 repent. And then he begins the next chapters up until where we're now talking about wrath. And instead of being exhausted, instead of being offended, instead of being worried, the way that we should look at that is, hey, if Jesus is saying this must be important. And I believe it's important for one simple reason. The purpose that all of us exist is, well, we exist because God created us, but we are here as a church so that we can tell others. I started last week off with in Acts 1, where Jesus is talking to the church, or he's talking to his disciples, and they say, hey, are you going to restore the kingdom now? Are you going to bring back this perfect world? Are you going to come and reign over all of this earth? And he tells them, he says, it's not your job to try and figure out the timing of things, to figure out the signs and the seasons. Your job is to go and preach the gospel. Why? Because here we are 14 chapters in, and there is still wrath. There's such an emphasis on the wrath of God and hell. What we just read in Revelation 14, the hell to come for those who don't believe. And our response, instead of being offended with that, our response is to preach the gospel, because the gospel is good news. Jesus says in John 3:17 that he didn't come to judge the earth. The earth is judged already. He came to save. See, the reality is the entire earth, if they're not following Christ, they're going into that winepress that we read about. Salvation is just that. It's God's last-ditch effort to save people who don't know him. So church, as we read Revelation 14, as we keep hearing about this wrath of God, instead of saying, man, that's harsh, or man, this is heavy, man, the reality is it should sober us to turn and tell someone who doesn't know Jesus about the salvation that's made available to them. That's why the gospel is good news, because the bad news is, if you don't know Jesus, you're meeting the end of Revelation 14. But the good news is God has made a way for all people who are imperfect like us, all people who fall short of the glory of God, can now receive salvation just for their faith in Jesus. And so that's the one takeaway from last sermon. I would encourage you to not even go back to the sermon, but to read Revelation 14 and remember there are people that we love, there are people that we know, people that we care about, that if they don't know Jesus, they're going to meet that end. Now that may be symbolic in Revelation 14, but Jesus makes it very clear hell is real. And there is a real penalty for sin. And there is a real coming doom for those who don't know him. But the good news is there is still time to repent and turn to Jesus. That's the application point. So whether you're not a believer, if you're not a believer, repent, turn to Jesus. If you are a believer, tell someone about the good news that they can be saved from the wrath to come. Now this week, we're going to be going to Revelation 15, maybe 16, depending on how fast I can get through it. But we're going to talk about not just the wrath in and of itself, but our reaction towards it. Because it's important. As we get into Revelation 15, we see that there are people around the altar, there are angels, and there are elders, and they have a response to the wrath of God that looks mighty different from ours. So the question that we're going to be answering for ourselves on Sunday is it okay for God to be God? It's really, really important, because often we see the bigness of God, the holiness of God, and we often get offended. We change our theology. We act like it's not there. We ignore it. And then we begin to get mad at people who would affirm that God is the same one that he said he is in his Bible. So instead of not talking about it, we're going to go through Revelation 15 and we're going to ask ourselves the question, is it okay for God to be God? I look forward to preaching on Sunday. I believe God has a word for us. I believe he has it every single week. So I'm not saying that as a cliche. I'm saying that because I believe that the Lord wants us to hear what he has on his heart. I'll be praying for you guys. I've been praying for you guys. Love you, and I'll see you on Sunday. God bless.
Though the storms may come and the